Sometimes in life, the hardest moments to endure are the ones where we feel the silence of God. We've all been there, haven't we? We've cried out in prayer, sought God with all of our hearts, but it feels as if heaven is silent. The answer we've been waiting for doesn't come, the peace we so desperately need doesn't appear, and we are left with nothing but silence. In our humanity, it's hard to understand why God, who is all-knowing and all-loving, would choose to remain silent when we need Him the most. But my friend, I want you to know today that God's silence is not a sign of abandonment. It is not a sign that He is distant or uncaring. In fact, sometimes God's silence speaks louder than any words He could ever say. When we find ourselves in these seasons of silence, we must remember that God operates on a different plane than we do. He sees the bigger picture. While we are consumed by the urgency of our requests, He is orchestrating a far greater plan than we could ever fathom. It's in these moments of silence that God is often doing some of His most profound work in our lives. He is shaping us, refining us, and preparing us for the very thing that we are seeking. His silence is not a rejection, but rather an invitation to trust Him more deeply. It is in the quiet moments that we learn to rely not on our own understanding, but on His wisdom. It's in the stillness that we are invited to grow in patience and faith. Do you remember the story of Job? A man who lost everything, his wealth, his health, and his family. For days he sat in the ashes, covered in grief and pain. And yet throughout this whole ordeal, Job never heard a word from God. He cried out, he pleaded, he questioned, yet God remained silent. It's easy to think that silence in such a moment means that God has abandoned us, but that's not the case. In Job's silence, God was doing a deeper work in him. Job's faith was being tested, his character was being refined, and his understanding of God was being deepened. It was in the silence that Job was able to make the profound declaration, "Slay me, yet will I trust in Him." What a powerful statement of faith. It wasn't a declaration made in the midst of God's spoken promises, but in the silence of the unknown. Now you might be thinking, but why does God remain silent at all? Why doesn't He speak more clearly when I need Him? It's a question I've asked myself many times, and I know many of you have as well. The truth is, God's silence is often a tool of transformation. When we experience silence, it forces us to lean in closer, to press deeper into the heart of God. In our desperation, we begin to seek God not just for what He can give us, but for who He is. We begin to discover a deeper relationship with Him, one that is not based on answers or immediate gratification, but on a trust that transcends our circumstances. There's something incredibly powerful about learning to trust God in the silence. When we're not getting the answers we want, when the pain seems unbearable, when the weight feels endless, that's when our faith can grow the most. God's silence strips away our illusions of control, and it forces us to realize that we can't do this life on our own. We need Him. And sometimes He uses silence to draw us into a place of total dependence on Him. I want you to think of a time in your life when you felt like God was silent. Maybe it was during a trial or a season of confusion, or when you were waiting for a breakthrough. And yet in that silence you learned something about yourself. You learned how to trust God in a deeper way. You learned how to rely on His promises even when you couldn't hear His voice. You learned that God's silence didn't mean He wasn't there. It meant He was at work in ways you couldn't see. You see, God speaks in many ways. Sometimes He speaks through His word. Sometimes through the counsel of others. Sometimes through the still, small voice of the Holy Spirit. But sometimes He chooses to speak through silence, and this is where our faith is truly tested. Will we trust Him even when we can't see the answer? Will we believe in His goodness when we can't hear His voice? This is the challenge of faith. It's not just about receiving what we ask for. It's about trusting God when we don't get what we want, when we don't hear what we expect. The silence of God is not a punishment. It is not a sign of His anger or disapproval. In fact, God's silence is often a mark of His trust in us. He believes that we are capable of standing firm in our faith, even in the absence of immediate answers. It is in those moments of waiting that we grow, that we learn to lean on Him more fully, and that we develop a deeper understanding of His character. As we move forward, I want to challenge you to rethink the silence in your life. Instead of seeing it as a sign that God is distant or unconcerned, see it as an opportunity. See it as an invitation to trust Him more fully, to depend on Him more completely, and to grow in ways that you would never have experienced if you had all the answers immediately. God's silence is not the absence of His presence. It is the invitation to experience Him in a deeper way. His silence is speaking volumes about His love for you, His plan for you, and His desire for you to grow in faith. So in the moments when you can't hear God's voice, remember that He is still speaking. It's just that the message He has for you in those times is different than the one you expect. He is working in you, shaping you, preparing you for what's to come. Trust Him in the silence. Keep praying, keep seeking, and keep believing. Because the silence of God is never the end of the story. It is simply the beginning of a deeper, more intimate journey with Him. Have you ever felt the weight of silence in your life? Have you found yourself in a place where despite all your prayers, all your pleas, and all your cries to God, it seems as if He isn't listening? You ask yourself, where is God in all this? And you wonder, why doesn't He speak to me? Why doesn't He act on my behalf? It's in those moments when we can't hear His voice that our faith is tested. It's in those times when we're walking through the quiet desert that we need to remember that God is still at work, even if we can't see it or feel it. You see, God's silence is not a sign of His absence, but rather a sign of His presence in a way we may not understand. In the Bible, there are many moments when God was silent. But as we look closer, we see that in His silence, He was doing something far deeper and more profound than we could ever imagine. Take, for instance, the story of the Israelites in the wilderness. They were slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years, crying out to God for deliverance. Finally, God answered their cries, parting the Red Sea and bringing them out of bondage. But then, in the wilderness, they experienced a different kind of silence. God had delivered them from Egypt, but now they were in a place where they didn't hear His voice as clearly. They had no immediate answers to their questions. They had no clear path to the promised land. For 40 years, they wandered in the desert, and it seemed that the silence of God had descended upon them. But let me tell you something, God was working. He was shaping them, refining them, and preparing them. The silence wasn't because God had forgotten about them. It wasn't because He didn't care. God was testing their faith. He was teaching them to trust Him, to rely on Him, and to learn that He is enough, even when everything around them seemed uncertain. Sometimes God is silent in our lives because He is teaching us the same thing. He is teaching us to trust His plan, even when we can't see it. He is teaching us to have faith in His timing, even when it feels like nothing is happening. I know that many of you are in a season where it feels like God is silent. You've prayed, you've believed, and you've done everything you know to do, and yet you can't hear His voice. You wonder, God, where are you? Why aren't you answering me? Why don't I feel your presence? My friend, I want to remind you today that silence is not the absence of God. It is often the place where He is doing His most powerful work. There are times when God's silence is His way of preparing you for something greater. In Isaiah 55, God reminds us that His ways are not our ways and that His thoughts are not our thoughts. We see things from a limited perspective, but God sees everything from the beginning to the end. What appears to us as silence may actually be God's way of working behind the scenes. He is orchestrating events, aligning circumstances, and preparing the right time for the answer to come. We may not understand it at the moment, but God's silence is a sign that He is at work, working things together for our good and for His glory. I want you to think about the example of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was in agony, praying earnestly, asking His Father to take the cup of suffering away from Him. He begged for a different way, but in that moment there was silence from God. Jesus didn't hear a voice from heaven reassuring Him. There was no miraculous intervention to remove the pain and suffering. But Jesus trusted His Father's will. He said, "And not my will, but yours be done." In that silence, Jesus submitted to the Father's perfect plan. He knew that the silence wasn't because God didn't love Him, but because the Father had a greater purpose. In our own lives, there are times when we experience that same kind of silence. It's a silence that tests our faith. It asks us if we truly believe that God's plan is greater than our own. It's in those moments that we must make the choice to trust God's will, even when we don't understand what's happening or why He is silent. Silence, my friend, does not equal absence. God is with you, working in ways you cannot yet see. Sometimes the silence is a way of protecting us. God's timing is perfect, and He knows that if He were to answer our prayers too quickly, we might not be ready to handle the blessings that are coming. It's like a child asking for something that they're not yet mature enough to manage. A loving parent doesn't give the child everything they want immediately because they know that at that moment it would not be good for them. God, in His infinite wisdom, knows that the delay in the answer is for our good. He knows that He is preparing us, refining us, and building in us a stronger faith. If we were to receive everything we asked for as soon as we asked for it, we might never learn to depend on God fully. We might never learn to trust Him in the way that He wants us to. God's silence, then, is a blessing in disguise. It's a way of shaping our character, molding us into the people He wants us to be. I know this might be difficult to hear when you are in the middle of a season of silence. You may feel like you are at the end of your rope, wondering if God even hears you. But let me assure you today, He hears you, and He is working. His silence is not a denial. It is an invitation to go deeper in your trust, to rely on Him more completely, and to wait with expectant faith for His perfect timing. The Bible tells us that those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. When we wait on God, when we trust in His timing, we are transformed. We become more like Him, and we become more prepared for the blessings He is about to pour into our lives. You see, God's silence is not the end of the story. It's just a part of the journey. And in the end, His silence will speak louder than anything we could have ever imagined. So, my friend, if you're in a season of silence, know that God is still there. He is still at work. He is still listening. And His perfect plan is unfolding in ways you may not yet see. Trust Him. Trust His timing. And know that the answer you've been waiting for is closer than you think. It's in the quiet moments of life that we often hear God speak the loudest, even though His voice may not be the way we expect it. The truth is, when God's silence seems to envelop us, it often means that He's doing something far greater than we can comprehend. You see, God's ways are higher than our ways, and His thoughts are not like our thoughts. As humans, we are limited in what we can see and understand, but God sees the beginning from the end, and it's in His silence that He's often preparing us for what's coming next. I want you to know today that silence is not a denial from God. It's a divine interruption. A holy pause to ready you for what lies ahead. Think about the story of Abraham. God called him to leave his homeland, to go to a place that He would show him, though Abraham did not know where that place was. Abraham followed God's call, but along the way there were seasons of silence. God had promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, but for many years there was no sign of that promise coming to pass. Abraham's faith was tested time and time again as he waited. And in the silence, it seemed as though God was not moving at all. And yet in that silence, God was working behind the scenes, preparing Abraham for the fulfillment of His promises. Abraham had to wait. He had to trust. And when the time came, God's promise was fulfilled in ways that Abraham could not have imagined. In those silent years, Abraham learned that the timing of God is perfect, even when it doesn't make sense to us. Abraham could have grown impatient. He could have taken matters into his own hands, as he almost did when he fathered Ishmael, but God's silence was teaching him that God's ways are always better than our own. I believe some of you are in a similar place today. You've received a promise from God, but it feels like time is standing still. You wonder, when will this promise come to pass? When will God fulfill His word to me? You see, waiting is not easy. It never has been. But God's silence is not His rejection. It is an invitation to wait with faith, to trust His timing, and to know that He is at work, even when we cannot see it. I think of David, who was anointed as king of Israel as a young boy. God had called him to be the king, and yet for many years, David's life seemed to go in the opposite direction. Instead of sitting on the throne, David was running for his life from King Saul, who was jealous of him. It must have felt to David that God's promise was never going to be fulfilled. David was waiting in silence. And yet in that silence, God was refining David's character, preparing him for the throne. It was in the wilderness that David learned to trust God in a way that would serve him for the rest of his life. It was in the silence that David learned that God is faithful, even when we are not. In your own life, you may feel like God has promised something to you, but you've been waiting for what feels like an eternity. Perhaps you feel like David, surrounded by difficulties and challenges, wondering why things aren't happening according to your timeline. But I want to encourage you today that God's silence is not abandonment. It is an opportunity for your faith to grow stronger. God is working in the silence. He's preparing you, just like he prepared David for the moment when the throne would be his. God is working behind the scenes, even when we can't see it. Sometimes God remains silent because he is waiting for us to fully surrender to his plan. We may want things on our terms. We may want them in our timing. But God is calling us to a place of surrender, where we trust him with our whole hearts, even when we don't understand what he's doing. I've seen so many people over the years who have been waiting for God's answer, and when it didn't come quickly, they tried to take matters into their own hands. In your own life, you may be in a place where you feel as though God is silent. You've prayed, you've cried out, you've sought his will, and yet there is no clear answer. But I want you to understand that God is still at work. His silence is not inactivity. It is divine preparation. He is preparing you for something greater than you can see, something beyond what you can imagine. And during this time of waiting, he is building your faith. He is teaching you to trust him when you can't see the way forward. And that is a powerful lesson that we must learn. The silence of God is not an empty space. It is a place of refining. You see, we often think of God's answers as immediate solutions to our problems. But God is more concerned with our character than he is with our comfort. God's silence often comes when he wants us to grow, to mature, and to develop a deeper understanding of who he is and who we are in him. God doesn't want us to stay where we are. He wants us to grow in faith and trust and in obedience. And sometimes that means that we have to go through seasons where his voice seems distant, where his answers seem delayed. But it is in these moments that our faith is purified and strengthened. Think about the story of Job. Job was a man who suffered greatly. He lost his wealth, his health, and even his family. He was in the midst of intense pain and sorrow, and yet God remained silent for much of his journey. Job cried out to God, asking why he was suffering, but God didn't give him the answers he wanted. Instead, God allowed Job to experience the full range of his emotions, to wrestle with his doubts and his fears, and to ultimately come to a deeper understanding of God's sovereignty. In the end, God revealed himself to Job in a mighty way, and Job's faith was stronger than ever before. But it was in the silence that Job was refined. It was in the waiting that he learned to trust God, even when he didn't understand his ways. This is the reality for many of us today. We may be facing difficult circumstances. We may be wondering where God is and why he seems silent. But I want to tell you that your waiting is not wasted. In the silence, God is doing a deep work in your heart. He is teaching you to trust in his goodness, his faithfulness, and his perfect timing. And when he speaks, when he answers, you will see that it was worth every moment of waiting. God's silence is also a reminder that we are not in control. We live in a world that is obsessed with speed, with instant gratification, and with getting things done quickly. But God operates differently. He is not bound by time. He is not in a hurry. And he doesn't always give us the answers we want when we want them. He asks us to trust in his timing, to wait for his perfect will to unfold. And that requires us to let go of our desire for control and to surrender our plans to him. In the silence, God is also teaching us to listen more closely to his voice. When we are constantly bombarded by noise, by the distractions of life, the demands of our schedules, and the pressures of the world, it's easy to miss the still small voice of God. But when we are silent, when we are still before him, we can hear him speak in ways we never could before. Silence forces us to slow down and to be present with God, to listen for his direction and his guidance. And it's in these quiet moments that we often hear his voice more clearly. I know that waiting can be difficult. I know that it can feel like God is far away when we are struggling, when we are praying and not receiving the answers we hope for. But I want to remind you that God is never absent. His silence is not a rejection. It is an invitation to trust him more deeply. It is a call to surrender our own desires and to wait for his perfect plan to unfold. And when that plan is revealed, it will be more beautiful, more powerful, and more fulfilling than we could have ever imagined. So if you are in a season of silence, don't despair. Don't think that God has forgotten you. Don't believe the lie that He doesn't care. Instead, trust that God is working in the silence, preparing you for something greater. Allow His silence to refine you, to strengthen your faith, and to draw you closer to Him. And when the time is right, God will speak. And when He speaks, His words will be worth the wait. There's something powerful about silence, my friends. We often think of silence as empty or void, but it is anything but that in God's hands. In our world, we are conditioned to expect instant responses, immediate gratification, and clear answers. But when God is silent, it's not that He's absent or indifferent. On the contrary, silence often speaks louder than words. It's a form of communication, a divine invitation to grow, to trust, and to prepare ourselves for what's ahead. Now, I want you to consider a moment in your life when you've asked God for something important. You've prayed fervently. You've poured out your heart before Him, and yet the silence feels deafening. You might feel abandoned, rejected, or confused. But let me remind you, God's silence is not an indication of His absence. It's an invitation to move deeper into faith. When God is silent, He's asking us to trust in His timing. He's asking us to surrender our need to understand everything and to embrace the truth that His ways are far greater than ours. And that is not easy. It requires patience. It requires perseverance. And yes, it requires faith. I remember a time in the life of the great prophet Elijah. God called him to a task that was challenging, a task that would bring him face to face with the powers of the enemy. Elijah had experienced the power of God in mighty ways. But when he was running from Queen Jezebel, he found himself in a place of deep solitude. He fled into the wilderness, feeling overwhelmed, defeated, and discouraged. And what happened in that place of isolation? God wasn't found in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. No, God came to Elijah in a whisper, a still small voice. And that whisper was not filled with condemnation or rebuke. It was filled with the assurance that God was still present, still at work, and still guiding Elijah forward. Elijah had to listen carefully, for the voice of God wasn't loud or forceful. It was gentle, quiet, and full of peace. This is a powerful lesson for us. In times of waiting and silence, we may feel as though God is distant. We may want Him to shout His answers to us. We may long for clear signs and unmistakable direction. But God's ways are different. God speaks to us in the quiet moments. He speaks to us when we are still, when we are patient, and when we are willing to listen deeply. You see, silence isn't just about God not speaking. It's about us preparing to hear His voice in a way that we never have before. The Bible tells us that God's thoughts are not our thoughts, and His ways are not our ways. We live in a world that moves fast, that demands answers and solutions immediately. But God's timing is perfect, and His silence is often part of the process that prepares us for what He has in store. When He remains silent, it's not because He's ignoring us. It's because He's refining us. He's teaching us patience, endurance, and trust. And while we may want to rush ahead and figure things out on our own, God is teaching us to wait on Him, to lean into His presence, and to trust that in the silence He is still at work. Take, for example, the story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He prayed earnestly to the Father, asking if there was another way. He pleaded for the cup to be taken from Him. But there was no answer. There was only silence. And in that silence, Jesus chose to trust in the Father's plan. He surrendered His will to God's will, knowing that God's timing was perfect. And ultimately, that silence was the very thing that led to His greatest victory. God was at work in the silence, preparing Jesus for the cross, and through that silence, salvation was brought to the world. You see, when we are in the silence, we are not abandoned. God is working in ways that we cannot yet understand. He is preparing us for something greater. And while it may feel like we're waiting forever, God's timing is always right. We must trust that even in the quiet moments, He is moving. Even when we don't hear His voice, He is guiding our steps. And when He is ready to speak, His words will come with clarity and with power. But until then, we must trust in the silence, knowing that God is not ignoring us, but preparing us. Now, I know this is not easy. In our human nature, we want things to happen quickly. We want to see results, to hear answers, and to move forward. But God's silence is not a denial of His love or His presence. It is a divine pause, a time of waiting that teaches us to trust in Him more deeply. It's in the silence that God's character is often revealed to us. We begin to see that He is faithful, that He is trustworthy, and that His timing is perfect. And as we grow in our understanding of His ways, we can rest assured that in due time He will speak again. When we speak again, think about the times in your life when God has answered your prayers. How many times has He done so in a way that you didn't expect? How many times has He given you something better than you could have imagined? You see, God's silence isn't because He's not answering. It's because He is preparing something greater than you could have ever imagined. His silence is a sign that He's working behind the scenes. He's shaping your heart, refining your faith, and getting you ready for the blessing He's about to pour out. In the end, silence speaks louder than words. When God is silent, it's an invitation to trust, to listen, and to grow. It's a call to deepen our faith, to learn to rely on God's timing and to recognize that He is always present, even when we can't hear Him. And in those moments, we find that God's silence is not empty at all. It's filled with purpose, filled with meaning, and filled with the promise that He is with us, guiding us every step of the way. So if you find yourself in a season of silence, don't lose heart. Don't give in to the temptation to believe that God has abandoned you. Know that He is with you even in the quiet, and that His silence is preparing you for something greater. Trust in His perfect timing, and when He speaks again, you will hear Him loud and clear. His words will come with power, with purpose, and with the assurance that everything He has promised you will come to pass. And in the end, you'll realize that the silence was worth it. For in it, you've come to know God more intimately, more deeply, and more faithfully than ever before. When we find ourselves in the silence of God, it can often feel like the very ground beneath us is shaking. We live in a world that demands instant responses, where technology has programmed us to expect quick results and immediate feedback. But when God is silent, it forces us to confront something deeper, something more lasting than mere answers. It forces us to confront our trust, our patience, and most importantly, our faith in His perfect plan. The truth is, God's silence can be one of the most powerful experiences of our Christian walk, but only if we learn to trust Him in the quiet. You see, silence doesn't mean He's forgotten us, or is ignoring us, forgotten us, or is ignoring us. Rather, silence is often God's invitation to enter into a deeper relationship with Him. It is a time for us to stop, listen, and reflect on His purpose. We must remember that in the silence, God is at work. He is doing things behind the scenes that we cannot yet see. Just because we can't hear Him doesn't mean He's not there. In fact, sometimes it is in the silence that we experience God in the most profound ways. Consider the great men and women of faith who have gone before us. Many of them endured seasons of silence before receiving the breakthroughs they were praying for. Abraham waited for years before the promise of Isaac was fulfilled. David spent years running from Saul, hiding in caves and fearing for his life. Even the great prophet Elijah experienced times of silence when he thought God had abandoned him. And yet, in all of their struggles, God was there, working, preparing, and refining their hearts. The same is true for you today. When you find yourself in a season of silence, don't despair. Understand that God is not silent because He doesn't care. No, He's silent because He's doing something powerful in you. God is preparing you for what is ahead. He's refining your character, deepening your faith, and preparing you to receive what He has promised. You see, there are moments in life when God's plan for us requires us to wait. It's not because we've done something wrong, or because we're being punished, but because there is something inside of us that needs to grow before we can fully step into the next season of His purpose. I think of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Now that was a long time. They cried out for deliverance. They cried out for food. They cried out for water. And yet for 40 years, God allowed them to walk in the wilderness. Why? Why didn't He just lead them into the promised land immediately? The answer is simple. They weren't ready. They needed to learn to trust God in ways they never had before. They needed to learn that God was their provider, their protector, and their source of strength. Without the wilderness experience, they wouldn't have been able to handle the blessings of the promised land. It was in the silence and the waiting that God shaped them into the people He needed them to be. This is the lesson we need to learn in our own lives. When God is silent, it's because He's preparing us for something greater than we can imagine. It's easy to think that the silence means He's forgotten us, but the truth is, silence is often the very thing that brings us closer to Him. In those moments of quiet, when we can't hear His voice, we learn to rely on His promises. We learn to trust that He's still working, even if we can't see it. And most importantly, we learn to trust His timing. And let me tell you this, friends, God's timing is perfect. It's not always our timing, and it's not always comfortable, but it's always perfect. The Bible says in Isaiah 55:8-9, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways." God sees the whole picture from beginning to end. He knows what we need and when we need it. And while we may want to rush ahead, trying to force things to happen in our time, God knows exactly when to move and when to remain silent. And when He moves, it will be at the perfect time, His time. We often mistake silence for absence. We think that because we can't hear God's voice, He isn't there. But nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, some of the most profound moments of God's presence in my life have come when He was silent. It's in those times that I have learned to listen more intently to what He is doing, rather than focusing on what He is saying. Silence teaches us to trust, to be still, and to know that God is in control. But let's be clear about one thing. Silence is not the absence of God's presence. It's the invitation to trust Him more deeply. When God is silent, He is asking us to step out in faith and believe that He is still with us, even though we can't feel Him. He is asking us to trust His heart, even when we can't hear His voice. And when we learn to trust Him in the silence, we become stronger, we become more steadfast, and we become more aware of His presence in our lives. Think of Jesus' life for a moment. In His ministry, He often withdrew to quiet places to pray, to listen to the Father, and to seek guidance. At one point, He was silent before His accusers, not offering a defense, not speaking a word in His own defense. And in that silence, the greatest victory in the history of mankind was won. It was through the silence of the cross that God brought about the greatest redemption the world has ever known. Jesus didn't need to say a word because the silence itself spoke louder than any words could. In the same way, God is often silent in our lives because He is doing something deeper, something more eternal than we can understand. He is shaping us, preparing us, and drawing us closer to Himself. And when He speaks, when the silence is broken, we will understand that everything He did in the silence was for our good. The waiting, the refining, the stretching, it was all part of God's perfect plan. So in your own life, when you feel the silence, don't be discouraged. Don't let it drive you to despair. Instead, embrace it. Let it be a time of reflection, a time of growth, and a time of trust. Know that God is still with you, that He is still working in you, and that His silence is part of His greater plan for your life. He is preparing you for something incredible. And when the silence ends, when He speaks again, you will know that His timing was perfect, that He was with you all along, and that His plan for your life is greater than anything you could have imagined. Remember this. Silence speaks louder than words, because in the silence, God is drawing us nearer to His heart, preparing us for the next season of His purpose. And in that silence, we find the deepest kind of peace that comes from knowing that God is in control, even when we can't hear His voice. Trust in the silence, my friends. It speaks more than you'll ever know. There are moments in life when you find yourself at a crossroads. You've prayed, you've hoped, you've believed, and yet God remains silent. There's a heaviness that weighs on your heart. It's not that you've done something wrong, you've done everything right. You've followed His word, you've lived with integrity, and yet you still find yourself in a season of waiting. I want to encourage you today, God's silence does not equate to His absence. His silence does not mean He is ignoring you or that He has forgotten about you. No. Sometimes God's silence is His way of drawing us closer to Him. He's not absent. He's simply asking us to trust Him more deeply. If you've been in a time of silence, whether you're waiting for an answer, a breakthrough, or a direction, know this, you are not alone. You are not the first to experience God's quiet. In fact, many great men and women of faith throughout history have walked the same path. Consider the Apostle Paul. He faced countless trials, shipwrecks, imprisonment, and even persecution for the sake of Christ. Yet in his moments of isolation, he didn't give up on God. He didn't assume that God was silent because he didn't care. No, Paul pressed in. He grew closer to God through the silence. And when God spoke, the world was forever changed. We see this pattern throughout Scripture. God's people, in times of silence, are being prepared for something greater. In the silence, there is often a refining process. The silence purifies our faith. It tests us. It asks us whether we truly trust God, not just for the things He gives, but for who He is. Do we trust Him in the waiting? Do we trust that His timing is perfect even when we can't see the way ahead? It's in those moments that our faith is refined, purified like gold in a fire. You know, friends, when we think about silence, it's easy to mistake it for rejection. We wonder, where is God? Why has He not answered my prayer? But the truth is, God doesn't work on our timetable. He's not bound by the same constraints that we are. While we look at the clock, He looks at the heart. God's delays are not denials. His timing is not our timing, and His ways are not our ways. And in the silence, He's working things out in ways we can't fully comprehend. I think of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before His arrest. He prayed fervently, asking God to take the cup of suffering from Him. 3 times He prayed, and 3 times He heard no response. Yet in that silence, He surrendered to God's will. He didn't demand an answer or an explanation. He said, "Not my will, but yours be done." In the silence, Jesus was strengthening His resolve. He was aligning Himself with the Father's will, and the silence of that moment paved the way for the salvation of the world. The silence of Gethsemane was not the end. It was the beginning of God's greatest work. In your life, friends, the silence is not the end. It's the beginning. It's the beginning of something deeper, something more profound. Just because God is silent doesn't mean He is not at work. On the contrary, it often means He is working in ways that we cannot yet understand. The silence is not an indication that He's forgotten you. It's a signal that He's preparing something great for you. Don't give up in the silence. Don't grow weary in waiting. The very fact that you are waiting means that God is still working on your behalf. I know that waiting can be hard. It can feel like you're in a holding pattern with no clear direction and no clear answer. But in these moments, you must trust in God's sovereignty. You must trust that He sees the big picture when you can only see a small part of the puzzle. And you must trust that His silence is not a sign of rejection, but an invitation to grow in your faith. God is calling you to trust Him in ways that you've never trusted Him before. Remember that God's silence is not an absence of care. It is an invitation to deeper intimacy with Him. In the silence, He is asking you to press in, to draw near to Him, to listen more closely for His voice. And when you learn to hear His voice in the silence, you will find that His words are more precious than gold. You will discover that His timing is always perfect, and His plans for you are always good. I want to challenge you today. Don't waste the silence. Don't rush through it or try to fill it with noise. Instead, embrace it. Use it as a time to draw closer to God. Ask Him to show you what He's teaching you in this season. Ask Him to help you trust Him more deeply. In the silence, God is revealing Himself to you in ways that words can't express. So embrace the silence, trust His heart, and know that He is at work in your life. One of the greatest lessons in the silence is learning to wait on God's perfect timing. It's easy to want things right now, to pray for immediate answers, and to grow frustrated when things don't happen as quickly as we think they should. But we must remember that God sees the whole picture. We learn to trust Him when we cannot see the road ahead. We learn to depend on Him when we cannot hear His voice. We learn to rest in His promises when everything around us seems uncertain. This kind of faith does not come easily. It is forged in the fire of trial and testing. It is developed in the stillness of the waiting. And when we wait patiently on the Lord, when we trust Him in the silence, we find that He renews our strength. He renews our hope. And He prepares us to soar on wings like eagles, to run and not grow weary, to walk and not faint. The silence is not meant to break us. It is meant to build us. It's in the silence that we are shaped and molded into the people God has called us to be. It's in the silence that we learn to wait on God's timing and to trust His perfect will. It's in the silence that we experience His peace in a way that we never could in the noise of the world. And it's in the silence that we draw closer to Him, because we are forced to rely on Him and Him alone. You might be wondering, how much longer will this silence last? How long do I have to wait for God to speak? And the truth is, I don't have an answer for you. I don't know how long your season of waiting will last. But I do know this. God is faithful, and He will answer in His time. You see, God's silence is never the end of the story. It's always the beginning of something greater. When God breaks His silence, when He speaks to you, it will be worth the wait. His answer will be more than you could ever imagine. His timing will be perfect, and His plan will be fulfilled in ways that will leave you in awe of His wisdom and goodness. There's a story in the Bible that I believe captures this truth beautifully. It's the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel. Elijah had been calling on God to send rain after a long drought. For 3.5 years there had been no rain, and the land was parched. Elijah prayed fervently, but for a long time there was no answer. And yet, Elijah did not give up. He continued praying. He continued trusting. And then on the 7th time, the servant saw a small cloud in the sky, a sign that God had answered. The silence was broken, and the rain came. This story reminds us that God's silence does not mean that He is absent. He is working, even when we cannot see it. He is answering, even when we don't hear His voice. And when He does speak, it will be clear and undeniable. The answer will come, and it will be more than we could have ever expected. So, my friends, if you are in a season of silence, I encourage you to hold fast to your faith. Do not grow weary in well-doing. Do not give up on the promises of God. He is faithful. He will answer in His time. And when He does, you will see that it was worth the wait. In the silence, He is drawing you closer to Himself. In the silence, He is preparing you for something greater. And when He breaks His silence, you will know that His plan for your life is far more wonderful than anything you could have imagined. There are moments in life when we feel as though we've been abandoned. We are crying out to God, asking for guidance, for deliverance, for answers, and yet the heavens seem to be silent. The silence is deafening, and it seems as though God is distant, even though we know He promises never to leave us or forsake us. This is one of the greatest challenges to our faith, the experience of waiting in silence. But dear friend, I want you to understand that silence is not the absence of God. It is the presence of His perfect plan unfolding in His timing. The silence you may feel in this moment is not a punishment, nor is it a sign of God's disinterest in your struggles. It is, in fact, a part of the process, part of the divine work He is doing within you. The silence might feel like a void, but in reality, God is speaking through the quiet, shaping your heart, molding your character, and preparing you for what lies ahead. Think about the times when God has spoken most powerfully to you. Not through grand gestures or loud proclamations, but through a whisper, a still small voice that stirs your soul. I believe that in those moments of silence, God is doing a work in our hearts that words simply cannot do. He is teaching us patience, trust, and reliance on Him in ways that the noise of life could never accomplish. Do you remember the story of Job? Job was a man who experienced unimaginable suffering. He lost everything, his wealth, his health, his family, and yet, through it all, he never cursed God. Instead, he questioned, he cried out, and he waited. Job's entire journey was marked by a long silence from God. For days, for weeks, for months, God did not answer him. Job's friends came and tried to offer their wisdom, but it was all in vain. There was no answer, no relief, no clarity, only silence. And yet in the end, when God did speak, He spoke with power and authority. He reminded Job of His sovereignty, of His wisdom, and of His control over all things. And Job, in that moment of divine revelation, was humbled. His faith had been tested, and it had been strengthened. God had not abandoned Job. In fact, He had been at work the entire time, doing a work in Job's life that could not have been accomplished without the silence. In the same way, you might be going through a period of waiting. You might be wondering, why does God remain silent? Why am I left in this place of uncertainty? But I want you to know that God is not silent because He does not care. He is silent because He is preparing you. He is teaching you to trust in His timing, to rely on His strength, and to lean into His presence when all else seems to fail. The silence is a tool, a gift, a part of His plan. It is not a denial, but rather a way to strengthen your faith and deepen your dependence on Him. Now, let's not mistake God's silence for His absence. There is a vast difference. The absence of God would mean that He is not present with us. that he has turned his back on us, and that he is no longer working in our lives. But that is not the truth. The truth is that God is with us, even in the silence. He is always present, always faithful, and always working for our good. His silence is not a sign that he has abandoned us, but rather that he is preparing us for something greater, something beyond our current understanding. Think about how often in Scripture God has used times of silence to prepare his people for what was to come. Moses, for instance, spent 40 years in the desert alone in silence before God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. The silence in the desert was not a punishment. It was a preparation. God was teaching Moses humility, patience, and obedience. He was refining Moses, shaping him into the leader he needed to be for the great task ahead. Likewise, David spent years in the wilderness running from King Saul before he was finally crowned king of Israel. In the silence, David learned to trust God with his life, to depend on God for strength, and to seek God's guidance above all else. The wilderness was not a detour. It was part of the divine plan. God used that time of silence to prepare David's heart for the kingship he would one day hold. And then there was Jesus, who spent 40 days in the wilderness, alone, fasting and praying before he began his earthly ministry. During those days of silence, he was tempted, he was tested, and he was prepared for the work that lay ahead. The silence was not a sign of God's absence, but a time of preparation for the mission Jesus was about to undertake, the mission that would change the world forever. So, my dear friend, if you find yourself in a season of silence, don't despair. Know that God is not distant. He is not silent because he doesn't care. He is silent because he is working behind the scenes, preparing you for something greater than you can imagine. He is shaping your heart, teaching you to trust in his perfect timing, and preparing you to fulfill the purpose he has called you to. God's silence does not mean God's absence. It simply means that he is working in ways that you cannot yet see. His silence is not a sign of neglect. It is a sign of his trust in you, that he believes you are capable of waiting on his perfect timing. And in the end, when he speaks, his words will bring clarity, peace, and direction. They will be worth the wait. As you wait in the silence, I encourage you to trust. Trust that God is faithful. Trust that his timing is perfect. Trust that he is with you even in the silence. He will never leave you or forsake you. His silence is not a rejection. It is part of his divine plan. And when the time is right, he will speak, and you will know that the waiting has been worth it. So, my friends, let us not grow weary in the silence. Let us not lose hope. Let us trust in the God who is always present, even when we cannot hear his voice. His silence speaks louder than words. It is a sign of his presence, his faithfulness, and his love for us. And in the end, we will see that it was all part of his perfect plan. As we come to the end of our message today, I want you to take a moment to reflect on the powerful truth we've been exploring. You may have found yourself in a place of silence, wondering why God isn't answering your prayers or speaking to you as clearly as you hoped. You've been waiting, perhaps for weeks, months, or even years, and the heavens seem silent. But I want to remind you that God's silence is not a rejection. It is not a rejection. It is not a sign of his absence, nor does it mean that he has forgotten about you. Far from it, my friend. His silence is a part of his divine plan. You see, the silence you experience in your life is not the end of the story. It is, in fact, often the beginning of something profound. God uses silence to prepare us, to strengthen us, and to teach us deep lessons that we can only learn when the noise of the world fades away. We live in a world that is constantly shouting at us, pulling our attention in 1,000 different directions. But in the silence, God has an opportunity to reach into the depths of our hearts and speak to us in ways that words alone cannot express. This moment of quiet, this waiting period, is God's way of refining us. It is not meant to break us, but to build us. Think about the process of refining gold. The gold is placed into a furnace and the heat is turned up. The impurities rise to the surface and the goldsmith carefully removes them. This process takes time and it often feels uncomfortable. But in the end, gold is pure, shining brightly, ready for its purpose. Similarly, God uses the silence and the waiting to refine our hearts, to remove the impurities of doubt, fear, and impatience, and to make us more like Christ. In Psalm 46:10, the Word of God says, "Be still and know that I am God. This verse speaks volumes about the power of silence. In our stillness, in the quiet moments when we feel like we are waiting on God to act, we are invited to remember that He is God. He is in control. He has never lost His grip on the situation. He is not absent. In fact, He is closer than ever, working behind the scenes, preparing us for what is to come. Let me tell you, my friend, you are not alone in this waiting. You are not abandoned in your silence. God is at work in your life, even when you cannot see or hear Him. The silence is not empty. It is full of purpose. It is in these moments that God is preparing your heart to receive His blessings, His direction, and His answer in a way that you could never have imagined. Consider the life of the Apostle Paul. Before he became the great missionary and church leader we know him as, he was Saul, a man filled with passion but also full of pride, misunderstanding, and zeal for the wrong things. It was only through his time of silence, through his blindness and his waiting, that God was able to break through and transform his life. Saul's encounter with God on the road to Damascus led to his conversion, but it was in the period of blindness and stillness that God worked mightily in his heart. God used the silence to prepare Saul to become the great apostle Paul. That silence was not the end of the story. It was a necessary part of the process. And so it is with you. You may not understand what God is doing in this moment. You may not be able to see His hand moving in your life. But know this, God is never inactive. Even in silence, He is working. Even when you cannot hear His voice, He is leading you, guiding you, and preparing you for something beyond what you can currently grasp. His timing is perfect. He knows the right moment to speak, the right moment to act, and the right moment to bring forth the breakthrough you've been waiting for. I encourage you today to trust in His timing. Trust that He knows what He is doing, even when you cannot see the full picture. You see, God sees the beginning and the end. He knows the plan He has for you, and He is guiding you toward it, even when you feel like you're wandering in the wilderness. Just as the Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years, they were not abandoned. They were being prepared for the land of promise. And so, even though you may feel like you are in a dry and barren place, trust that God is using this time to prepare you for something greater. In the silence, God is cultivating a deep trust in you. He is teaching you to rely on Him and not on your own understanding. He is teaching you to trust that His ways are higher than your ways, that His timing is perfect, and that He knows exactly when to open the doors you have been praying for. The silence is not a sign of God's delay. It is a reminder that He is working behind the scenes, preparing everything for the perfect moment. Let me also remind you that silence does not mean you are without hope. On the contrary, it is in the quiet moments that we learn to cling to hope with greater strength. You may not have all the answers right now, but you have the assurance of God's presence. He is with you in the waiting, He is with you in the silence, and He is with you as you trust Him to fulfill His promises. Keep your eyes fixed on Him, for He is faithful. He will never leave you, and He will never forsake you. And when the silence finally breaks, when God's answer comes, you will see that it was worth the wait. The timing of God is always perfect. He knows what you need, and He knows when you need it. His silence is not a denial. It is part of His divine plan. So as you wait, know that God is at work. Trust in His perfect timing, and rest in the assurance that He is with you every step of the way. My dear friend, I want to encourage you to embrace the silence. Do not fear it, do not dread it, but recognize it as a time of growth, of preparation, and of faith building. In the silence, God is doing something powerful in your life. Trust in His perfect plan. Lean into His presence. And when He speaks, when He moves, when He acts, you will know that the waiting has been worth it. Until then, hold on to the hope that God is never absent, even in the silence. His voice is still speaking and His work is still unfolding in your life. Trust Him, for He is faithful. His silence speaks louder than words.